Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today's guest is author, creative writing teacher, television writer, and former Marvel writer, Sam Beckbessinger, joining us to talk about her razor-sharp, darkly funny feminist horror novel, Femme Feral. It is out now, described by Booklist as an ambitious tale of perimenopause and lycanthropy. Femme Feral blends biting social commentary, horror, satire, and emotional honesty into a story about rage, identity, and transformation. The novel follows Ellie, an overworked mother and chronically undersupported wife who believes the hot flashes, insomnia, and sudden fury taking over her life are symptoms of perimenopause until she realizes she's becoming a werewolf. As her transformations intensify, so does the thrill of unleashing years of suppressed anger, but the consequences become increasingly dangerous. Sam grew up on a farm near Durban, South Africa, and now lives in London, where she teaches creative writing at Bath University and writes for television and children's books, too. I'm happy to welcome for the first time to the Speaking of Writers podcast, Sam Beckbessinger. Welcome.
Hi, Steve. What a great intro. Thank you.
Thanks for being
You
here.
you do you do it better than I do, the description of the book.
Well, what was the very first spark for Femme Feral? Was it the werewolf idea first, or the themes surrounding women's rage and perimenopause?
It was kind of both running on parallel tracks, I think. So I'm a lifelong horror junkie. My mom loved horror, so I grew up. I worried many librarians reading Stephen King at far too young an age and loving it. And I read all the Goosebumps books, as a young kid. So I think I've always loved werewolves, and I've always loved how horror can act as a metaphor to talk about very real life horrors. So definitely that's always been a thread running in my brain. There was a specific moment though in my life that I very distinctly remember. It must have been about 10, 15 years ago now. It was one of those sort of very beautiful summer's days. I was living in Cape Town in South Africa, and I was walking to a friend's birthday party. And it was gorgeous, and I was wearing a little summer dress, and I was feeling so happy. I was going to go see my friends, just having a great day. And then I slowly became aware of the fact that I was being followed by some creepy guy.
Mm.
And, this is an experience I'd had many times before, and many people in the world have had many, many times. And I felt afraid, as you do when this happens. And I did all the things that you do. I like grabbed my car keys and my handbag, and I started looking for a shop I could run into. And I did all those things. But I remember very clearly in that moment, something happened that hadn't ever happened before in my brain, which is that I suddenly had this fantasy that I could turn around to him and I could pull a weapon out of my bag and I could make him feel afraid. It's the first time I ever remember in a moment like that, not only feeling fear, but also feeling anger, because I felt like, well, I was having a great day and you ruined my day. How dare you? And that moment, I think, lodged in my brain for a really long time. Just that feeling of anger and curiosity about anger. I think I've always felt about myself like I'm not an angry person. And it's taken me a long time. It was really only kind of as I started approaching 40, I think, that I started to wonder whether that was actually true, or if as women, we're socialized out of recognizing our anger so much because it's still today not an acceptable emotion for women to feel. And I guess those two threads started to sort of come together, thinking about these metaphors of monsters and transformation, and thinking about perimenopause as me and my friends were starting to hit that moment of real world transformation. With that very clear image, I think, of, wondering about violence and the fury that had been repressed inside of me, and imagining what would that look like if I could personify it or beastify it, I guess, in the symbol of a different self, of this beast self that could come out of me, and what might that do?
You described the novel as dark comedy, horror, social commentary, all at once. Did you always know the tone would balance humor with something much more unsettling?
I think that I am just incapable as a person of talking about serious things without trying to make a joke. I think that's just how my brain works. And I really think that horror and humor, they're a hair's breadth from each other in life as well as in fiction. I definitely the most horrifying and difficult moments in my life have been the ones that I've felt compelled to make jokes about. And I think that in my writing, I think what's at the heart of both horror and humor is taboo and fear, I guess. So I think it's just that's always been how I write anything, I think, is sort of this blending of tone. I think that the main character, Ellie, her voice crystallized very, very early in writing the story. I worked on this book for many, many years. And the first draft was very much a discovery draft or a vomit draft where I hadn't planned it. And it really felt like I was going spelunking in my unconscious and I was just following these dark passages to see where they went. And exploring plot lines and just following the characters around. And there were many, many things on a plotting level that changed draft to draft. But the thing that was there pretty much from the beginning was Ellie's voice. I think so. There's this technique that I use in the book where Ellie sort of thinks in to-do lists, which is very much how the experience of the mental load, I think, for many people around this age, specifically many women around this age, sort of just this infinite to-do list of things that she needs to do that she's never going to be able to do everything of. And that list, I think, that was the key to her voice, and the list sort of starts becoming more and more absurd, I think, as the story starts veering into the supernatural. It becomes a to-do list of okay, now you know you're a werewolf, what do you buy from the shops if you're a werewolf at one point, you know. But and that was there pretty much from the first chapter, the first time, the first draft, the first time I sat down and wrote. I think Ellie was there and she was very clear and her voice was very clear from the beginning. And it is this quite sardonic, detached, goofy voice.
All right, Sam, let's talk werewolves. They have long been metaphors in fiction for fear, repression, desire, transformation. What made them the perfect monster for this story?
Well, what I love about the werewolf as a metaphor, as a monster, is for most of the 20th century, I think the werewolf was one of the most persistently masculinized creatures. I think that the vast majority of werewolf movies and books that I had read or seen, it had very much been used as a metaphor to describe male aggression and male violence and the kind of animal nature of ourselves, of man in a civilized society, and the things, the animal parts of you, the violent parts of you that aren't suppressed, and the hungry parts. And you know, there's a few exceptions that I have loved pretty much my whole life. And one of the real touch points for me was Ginger Snaps, the film, which uses the werewolf as a metaphor to explore puberty and female puberty. You know, what is perimenopause if not another form of puberty? And the young adult novel that I wrote a few years ago with my friend Dale Halverson was also a book about the monstrousness of adolescence. So, and in that story, the not to get too spoilery, but the monster is a giant tapeworm creature. And this one, I think the werewolf felt like a perfect metaphor. What's really interesting if you peel back the layers of the werewolf in Western culture, uh, is it actually has a long history as a female monster
Mm.
before the 20th century. Because if you go back into medieval Europe, there were werewolf trials across the continent, and they went hand in hand with witch trials. Because the accusation was that one of the things witches could do is they could turn themselves into werewolves. So not everyone prosecuted as a witch or as a werewolf was female, but a large portion of people were. And there are many folk stories in many different European cultures that specifically link, I guess, the werewolf metaphor to anxieties about women, particularly, and women's reproduction and women's embodied selves and women's appetites. So, particularly as a feminist monster, that was really, it was a fun thread to pull, sort of to go and dig in there. Because, yeah, I think when I started off thinking about it, part of what was fun was it felt subversive, right? Like a female werewolf, a perimenopausal werewolf, that felt like an interesting kind of new idea that I hadn't seen. But yeah, the more I researched, the more I realized, oh no, this is old. This is an old symbol for this. And like Angela Carter, the Bloody Chamber, I mean, she's referencing some of those very old stories about middle-aged women often being these kind of creatures of suspicion in our cultures, creatures who the culture sees as monstrous in this very particular kind of way.
Hmm. Ellie spends so much of her life being relentlessly competent. Why was it important for you to build a protagonist whose strength is also trapping her too?
That's a great way of putting it. Because I really think that that is what has happened to Ellie, the protagonist, is she is she's a hyper functioner. So she has kept it together for 43 years of her life and not, kept everything together. She has kept a home running. She's kept her marriage running. She has raised her daughter with not enough support. She has a very demanding career. She's been instrumental in building a company. She has many, many responsibilities that she's accumulated because she can do them, but doesn't have any of the recognition for any of them. And I think what she doesn't recognize at the beginning of the story is how much that hyperfunctioning is also a way of avoiding thinking about things that are difficult. And I mean, while the story it isn't an autobiography, I didn't, hit 40 and turn into a werewolf yet. Yeah,
Yet,
obviously
yet
yet.
being the key word.
Well, I have started referring to my perimenopause as my werewolf era, which I'm enjoying. Um, but I think the thing that has come from my life, I think, is that I've refracted into the character, although the character is very different to me in other ways, is I think I also in my 20s and most of my 30s was a hyper functioning woman who felt like, so I'm an elder millennial, a geriatric millennial, and I feel like a message that many of us got as young girls was, we're one of the first generations who really can have it all, not realizing that having it all just meant that we had to do it all, right? And what I saw in myself and what I saw in so many of my friends was that we could pull that off for a while. But what happens is there's underneath all the functioning, there's there's a hollowing out that happens of yourself and your needs, and you can get so trapped by the roles that you play for other people that you lose touch with other things that are inside you. And really the beast, the werewolf was a way for me to, yeah, to imagine that all of those things that are repressed and suppressed, uh what can they curdle into, and imagining, yeah, what if that was a creature that forced you to confront it at some point, everything that you had been avoiding looking at.
Sam, you're from South Africa, as I said in the introduction. You now are in the UK. First off, how did you wind up in the UK? And second part of that is, how did you become a writer?
Those are great questions. The first one, so I mean, I mentioned this very briefly before we started recording, but I moved to London in January 2020, which ended up being an absolutely hilarious time to move. I was so excited about exploring the big city and traveling Europe. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, I mean, I love London. I always have, and I'd visited it many times through my life. I've been really lucky to do that, and I definitely don't feel like I left South Africa. Like South Africa is still very much my home. I think I just wanted to explore a little bit more of the world and try living somewhere else for a while. But I still feel very much like I have two homes now. I didn't leave South Africa. But London has been wonderful. And one of the things that was so joyful about the process of writing Femme Feral was I was writing my way into London while I was writing the story. Like it very much is a London book. And I spent so many hours, often at weird times of the early morning, going for long walks down all these kind of crevices and alleyways of the city, sort of looking around and trying to imagine where you could hide dead bodies and looking for interesting little corners that I could write horror set pieces in. And I mean, what a delicious way to get to know a city was by
Yes.
writing it. And one of the things I love about London as a city is it's a city with such a rich literary heritage,
Mm.
and it was really fun also playing with other werewolf stories that have been set here. Like I've woven in a lot of references to American Werewolf in London and various other sort of London werewolf stories in the novel, which was really, really fun. Um, as to how I became a writer, I don't think I ever became a writer so much as I never stopped being a writer. I think, like so many children, I just loved telling stories. I loved making up stories. And I just didn't ever stop doing that, right? So I there's never been a time in my life that I haven't, as my deepest love and my most important hobby, at least, been involved with tabletop role-playing games. I'm a big D&D nerd, Dungeons and Dragons. I'm part of many different writing clubs and groups, and it's always just been this kind of really deep need that I have. I've always kept journals. I've always blogged. Whatever outlet I can find. I made zines as a teenager. Like before anyone would publish what I had to write, I still felt that need and that joy to use that outlet, I guess. It's taken me a long time to figure out how to pay my bills with writing, which does seem like an entirely different thing. And I guess the answer there is that I crabbed walked my way in. I published my first book almost 10 years ago now. It was a non-fiction book back in South Africa. Oh, actually, no, I lied. My first book was a picture book that I wrote for a non-profit literacy organization in South Africa. My first breakthrough book was basically a book about how in my 20s I was deeply in debt, and I come from a family where there was an enormous amount of financial instability. And the thing that I always wanted to do was write and tell stories, but I had no idea how to do that and pay bills and get out of debt. And my problems were much more immediate. And I basically wrote a nonfiction book about that experience. And that was my first book. And that book kind of opened a bunch of doors that allowed me to try my hand at other forms of writing. And then I got involved in writing kids' TV shows. And then I got the Marvel gig. And I've really just sort of crab walked to novels, which I think is the thing that I've always wanted to do. But I think I just didn't really believe that I had this. I didn't have the confidence to try it. And I think on some level, I felt like I didn't have the right, to write novels, to be an author. Like, how dare you, it's still this little voice in my head. I still feel like that's only something very special people are allowed to do on some level of my brain. And a big part of the journey for me of, kind of really moving into being able to do this is just being about trying to ignore that part of me.
Was there
Yeah.
a teacher, muse, friend, mentor, confidant who gave you that confidence?
So many. I mean, I think that the first ones were my parents, right? Like my parents were big readers, and they read, like, my dad loved cowboy stories and Clive Cussler, and my mom loved Dean Koontz and Stephen King. So we just had these books like in every corner of my house growing up. And even when times were hard, like, we always had books around. And books, I think, were my first great love as a child. And my parents were so supportive of every dumb story that I ever wrote. And then I had a couple of really special teachers at school. I had librarians at school who, expressed concern at all the Stephen King I was reading, but didn't stop me. And in fact, suggested other books. And God bless librarians; they're the greatest people in the world.
Yes.
And then as an adult, like I've been so lucky. I think, there's this myth of writing as solitary, and there's a myth of the solitary writer who sits in their beautiful writer's garret and, speaks to the muse and produces beautiful, perfect words that they then send out into the world. And that hasn't at all been my experience. Like, I think for me, I was so lucky, I think, in my late 20s to meet a group of writers and in Cape Town. And I collaborated with them on on my first projects. For many years, I didn't write alone. I wrote with people. I was lucky enough for some of those people to become mentors as well. Lauren Beukes is a dear friend and a mentor. My friend Dale Helverson, who I co-wrote my young adult novel with. My friend Sam Wilson, who I started working on TV with. Yeah, I mean, and all of these people have been just so generous and also have made writing fun. Yeah, and it's only, it's taken me many years of writing with other people before. Again, I felt confident enough, I think, to try and write something entirely on my own. And even then, it hasn't been entirely on my own. So many friends have given me feedback and, generously let me talk through all the plot holes for many, many years. Yeah, so many.
Femme Feral fits into the growing wave of femme gore fiction. What excites you most about readers embracing these darker, more feral stories centered on women?
I mean, I just love it. I think it's overdue. Um, I think, as someone who loved horror growing up, there were women writing in horror, but they weren't highlighted to me as a child. Like I was not aware of the existence of Shirley Jackson until my mid 20s. And I wish I had read, we've always lived in the castle, which is now one of my all-time favorite books. But I wish I had met Mary Cat, like those dark, dark characters when I was their age, as opposed to only coming across them when I was much, much older. Uh, because I think it's so important for all people, I think, to learn to meet all the different parts of yourself, right? I think it's important for people who are raised as men to learn to meet the more sensitive and vulnerable parts of themselves without, I feel like that's okay. And I feel like it's so important for more people raised as women to learn to meet the angrier and less socially acceptable parts of ourselves. And I think that fiction is a beautiful way to help. It's they're keys to unlock these doorways in our mind and in ourselves. And it's been so exciting publishing around the time when there is this wave of just incredibly weird and dark and gory women writers like Artessa Moshfegh and Eliza Clark. And I mean, there's Gretchen Malkov, what's her surname? Anyway, sorry. There's so many, and it's just so beautiful to, yeah, to feel again like there's this wave of incredible writers that I get to publish with and be in conversation with in my story.
Other than wandering around the alleys and side streets of London that you did for some research for this book, what's something else readers would be surprised to learn about your writing process? Any unusual quirks?
I think I'll mention two things. I think the one is I'm a big believer in research, and because the real world is much, much stranger than anything you can invent. And so this is always the first thing that I try and really push my students to do is go out and talk to real people. And man, did I come across some remarkable people while researching the story. I think the most incredible was that I met a woman who has devoted her life to hunting down a serial killer of cats in South London, like a
Wow.
real life cat murder vigilante. Who inspired very much one of the characters in the book, my favorite character in the book, Brenda. Um, I guess the other thing I will say about my process is it probably involves more spreadsheets than the average author. And I had a lot of weird jobs in my 20s, but I spent, almost a decade working in the tech industry. And so I think I developed a real love of spreadsheets. I was a
Mm.
product manager who's the person whose job it is to kind of bring order to chaos. And my brain is naturally a very chaotic brain, and especially chaotic when I'm trying to imagine stories. So a lot of my writing process is trying to find ways to bring some kind of semblance of order to that mess. And yeah, so I create these incredibly complicated spreadsheets while I'm writing, tracking different plot lines and uh, trying to map the kind of emotions, the emotional journey different characters take, and also just make sure that I haven't entirely forgotten whole subplots, which is something that definitely happens. Yeah, so and that's probably a bit weird.
Why is Brenda your favorite character?
Well, Brenda, I think, is the foil to Ellie very much. So in the story, Ellie is the hyper competent woman in her 40s who, is becoming a werewolf. And Ellie is really, really repressed. And she, like I did, really believes that she just isn't an angry person. Anger is just not an emotion that she feels. And Brenda is very much the opposite. Brenda is in her 80s and she long ago ran out of fucks to give, basically. She has no lid on her temper. She is dogged and determined. And I loved writing her because she's so refreshing to me. Her way of being in the world is very different to my own naturally. In a way that felt very cathartic to write. Like she just acts. She can be very rude. Uh, it was also fun to write her because people absolutely underestimate her as they do in the real world, many older women. And she finds ways to use that to her advantage. And I think she was a great example for me and I learned this, I think, by writing her. Uh, she was a great example to me of how fury and anger can be such a powerful force for justice. She really uses her anger to fight for people who need fighting for. And I loved discovering how much warmth and love there really was underneath her fury, which I only did by hanging out with her. Also, it was great unleashing my inner crotchety octogenarian.
She is Sam Beckbessinger. The new book, Femme Feral, is out now. For more info on Sam, follow her online. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Steve. What a great chat.
Thank you. Same here. And don't forget to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast, Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. Thanks for watching and for listening to. I will talk to you again next time.